Rod heads up Cartwright Consulting, a strategic communication consultancy which works with agencies and in-house teams to deliver personal communication preparedness and organizational resilience. His focus is on issues and crisis communication, reputation and thought leadership, executive preparedness and leadership, communication and strategic problem solving. He brings a 25-year global PR agency pedigree in driving lasting reputational growth and business change. He has worked for market leaders including Ketchum, Tex 100, Hill & Knowlton Strategies, and others. During his career, Rod has taken on major global news events, such as the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines MH370 and the airline's subsequent restructuring. Please join me for his keynote entitled Plus ça change, 7 communication lessons from before COVID-19 that will inform the new normal.
So good morning, good afternoon and good evening wherever you are in the world. I'm Rod Cartwright and I'm delighted to be joining the Virtual Public Relations Summit, and a big thank you to Philippe for asking me on. Today I'm going to be addressing the topic that you see on screen, Plus ça change, 7 communications lessons from before COVID-19 to inform the new normal. So before I dig in, a tiny bit about me. 25 years in agency, including head of the global corporate practice at Ketchum, EMEA regional director at Text, now Archetype. I'm also currently deputy chair of the PRCA's global COVID-19 task force, and as of last Thursday, also a founding member of the Decision Circle, an initiative bringing together multidisciplinary experts to help small and mid-sized firms, charities and public bodies to make speedy decisions amid the turmoil of COVID-19. So what I want to do today is to start with a story that for me embodies much of what I'm going to be talking about today and encapsulates some of the key principles that I hope you will take away from this session. And it's the story of Airbnb. All of us know it to some extent, but I was interested to go back to the beginning. When in 2007, 2 guys moved from San Francisco, I think, to New York, discovered they couldn't pay the rent, realized that despite it being conference season for many major industries, all the hotel rooms were free. So they came up with an idea, which was to blow up a couple of airbeds and advertise for $80 a night that you could have an airbed and breakfast, hence Airbnb. Fast forward via the National Democratic Convention and many other trials and tribulations of growing a business to last year. Airbnb has become a global brand, has hosted over 2 million guests, and has a valuation north of 25 billion. So the story thus far is going rather well. And then, of course, as with so many organizations, COVID hits and the organization finds itself in very, very tricky waters. And then, along with pretty much every organization on the planet, COVID-19 hits. And like so many, Airbnb finds itself in incredibly choppy waters. And it's at that point that the CEO of Airbnb, Brian Chesky, comes up with what I view as perhaps the most impressive act, not only of corporate communication, but also of corporate behavior. An open letter published to the world, sent to all staff, with the tragic news that 25% of their workforce is going to be made redundant. A letter that spells out in detail the principles on which those who were to be let go would be selected based on the company's values, laying out the detailed process, laying out the timings, what would happen with healthcare, with job support, so that no one could be in any ambiguity that the process was thorough and equitable. And he finished with a section called Some Final Words, and I want to read just a couple for you. He says, "I've been inspired by you all. The world needs human connection more than ever, and I know that Airbnb will rise to this occasion because I believe in you. And I have a deep feeling of love for all of you. When we started Airbnb, our original tagline was travel like a human. The human part was always more important than the travel part. What we're about is belonging, and at the center of belonging is love. Heady stuff and from the heart. And he concludes by reminding those who are going to leave the company that it's not their fault, that the world will never stop seeking their talents. And he closes with the words, "I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for sharing those talents with us." So, as I say, a remarkable act of both communication and behavior that encapsulates many of the points I'm going to make today. So what am I going to cover? I'm going to talk about a phrase that is widely used, the new normal, and ask whether the new normal is nirvana, as many would have it, or is it a nadir? Is it the ultimate of despair and disaster for the world? I'm going to cover the expectation of change. What are people looking for, aspiring to, and hoping for as we move through the COVID cycle to recovery? I'm then going to look at 7 trends from before COVID-19 that I believe will and should inform the future in terms of corporate behavior and corporate communication. And then Phil and I are going to have an open dialogue and conversation about what I've covered. So let's dive in. If you say the word crisis to most people, if you were to do a straw poll of the man and the woman in the street, this is probably what you would get. The idea of disaster, of cataclysm, of catastrophe. And certainly for many, tragically, COVID-19 will have very, very severe consequences. But the reality is that if you look at the true roots of the word crisis, you see a very different meaning. The word actually comes from a Greek word krisis, and the irony is absolutely huge that the word means the point in a disease which determines whether the patient will recover or deteriorate. In other words, any crisis, and I use this frequently when I'm doing crisis communications work with clients, any crisis is not necessarily a disastrous endpoint. It is, in fact, a turning point, a point of inflection. And how you come out of that crisis is fundamentally determined by how you go into it. So, if you want another example, what you see on your screen is the Chinese symbol for crisis, which separately consists of the symbols for danger and for opportunity. The same idea of a turning point, not necessarily a disaster. So if there are multiple possible paths, what are those paths? Well, I think if you look at public debate, media debate, political discourse, there is a stream of discussion which views COVID-19 as almost a cleansing new normal for the world. The belief that in line with works like the donut economy, we will see a brave new era of conscious capitalism, characterized by fairness, justice, and equity, where the air will be clean, we'll hear the birds singing, where people will be able to enjoy greater balance and respect for each other, and that therefore will be governed by a sense of decency and by peace. So that is one possible trajectory, and many hope for this. But there's equally a second possible trajectory. And without being too doom-laden, that is a trajectory that potentially, almost certainly involves considerably higher levels of public and private debt, of pay restraint, potentially of austerity. A future which could involve austerity from governments, which could see the less good employers exploiting workers for the simple reason that unemployment is so high that people are happy to be in a job. And we could see some of the polarization already in place before COVID becoming even more acute. And we could see from the isolation and the uncertainty a rise, and we're seeing it already, of anxiety and mental illness. So 2 potential paths. The reality, of course, as with much of life, is that we will probably end up somewhere between the two, or at least with a mixture of them. And it'll be down to every single organization, government, community, and individual to choose which path we take through their own individual choices and actions and habits. That will determine whether we're going to see a bold new dawn, Hades on Earth, or somewhere in between. So what are the expectations for change? Well, we're already seeing a number of dynamics playing out. Of course, home working. We've seen Google and Twitter announce that they'll be extending home working at least to 2021. Morgan Stanley and Barclays saying they may never return to mass offices. We're seeing localization, not only of work, but of food, probably of holidays and travel. Our locale and our local area will become infinitely more important. We're seeing a greater focus than ever on well-being. We're seeing the digitalization of everything, of course, retail, but also healthcare and entertainment. We're seeing a widespread call for sustainability, true sustainability, to take the place of the climate emergency, which a matter of months ago was threatening to look like a train that had irreversibly left the station. There is a growing clamour for all of the elements of trust, what I've called Trust Plus. And finally, and every bit as importantly, there is a hunger for greater equity, focused very often on those not only in our health services, but our public services, and that sense that those who many had always written off as lower skilled outside the hospital sector have actually been fundamental to our very survival. So those are some of the change dynamics and the change expectations. So will the new normal be a revolutionary different change from what went before, or will we go back to our old ways? And how do we go about making those decisions? Well, my view is that while there will be much newness, what is new will largely be built on the old. They say in stand-up comedy, there are no new jokes. Music still depends on the same range of notes. The reality is it's how we put them together that makes for a rib-tickling joke or a moving aria. There's a great quote from Jeff Bezos where he says, "I'm almost never asked the question of what is not going to change in the next 10 years. And he says, I submit that that question is far more important than what is going to change. On a slightly more day-to-day level, the reality is that change invariably comes about when what went before contains the seeds of its own destruction, but also the seeds of what renewal will look like. And my argument today is that what fruit we bear depends on how we sow and feed and nurture and grow those seeds of change. And in a second, I want to look practically at how we can grow them to come to the best possible outcome as businesses and professional communicators. To close this section with one quote, I used to work for the Labour Party back in 1997. And when New Labour came into being, the Deputy Prime Minister once described New Labour as traditional values in a modern setting. For me, some of the old will be the new orange. It will be the new normal. And I'm going to look at what I mean by that through 7 specific trends from what went before and how they will morph to inform what comes in the future. So I'm going to start with what I call the human imperative and the human experience, with excuse for the profanity in the slide. I've long argued that whether you are a corporate communicator or a marketer, everything you do has to be founded and grounded in the basic needs, wants, and values of your audience, what I call the human imperative. And above all else, those values. And we'll come back to why that's so important. And it's vital to do so not only in what you think, your strategy, but in your actions, your corporate behavior, how you speak, your communication, and how you look, your brand. In other words, how you turn up, how you show up in every sense. Now, I want to give one worked example, which was a couple of years ago in the UK. KFC changed chicken suppliers and briefly ran out of chicken. And for a week, 2/3 of their franchisees were unable to serve chicken to their customers. So what did KFC do? Well, they did the unthinkable. If you ask a lawyer, they said they were sorry. They said a chicken restaurant without any chicken, that's not ideal. They took out national newspaper space in every single British newspaper, and they pulled it through to their socials. You had one job, KFC. How did you run out of chicken? We get it. You couldn't make it up, they went on. Now, this was a remarkably human and empathetic and humorous way of subverting their own brand. They changed KFC to FCK. And in the process, the initial research suggests that they massively helped their brand equity through that act of genuine empathetic communication. Point one. Point two is about demonstrating radical transparency and fearless listening. And again, a few examples. I've mentioned already the Airbnb example. And here in the letter is their process for making reductions. There was no guesswork here in how they'd chosen the people to leave. It was spelled out in black and white. Back in March, Marriott's CEO, Arne Sorensen, gave the most wonderful, heartfelt video, literally with a tear in his eye, as to why and how they were going to make difficult choices. And on the listening side, Starbucks very early were already seeing a wave of poor mental health amongst their employees from their employee engagement and listening. What did they do? They announced that every single Starbucks employee in the US would have access to up to 20 sessions of free psychological counseling. Point three is about engaging through purposeful storytelling. Now, this is a model I developed a couple of years ago, and I'll dwell on it very briefly. But there are 7 preconditions of a great story. The storyteller has to be credible, has to have a right and a permission to tell the story. The story itself has to be relevant and credible. I'll come back to the notion of intent. The medium has to be right. And in a world where everything, at least for the moment, has become highly digital, there are choices within the digital and social sphere to be made. The audience, there has to be an acute and detailed understanding of their drivers, their motivations, hopes, fears, and aspirations. And the storyteller has to understand the context of what's going on. Think of Gillette's toxic masculinity campaign. Think about Nike with Colin Kaepernick, all based on daring creative, based on an acute understanding of audience and context. And as critical as the story itself is matching the behavior of the organization so as to avoid what they call a say-do gap between what a corporation or a brand claims and what it delivers in its actions. Now, I'm going to play 2 short videos, one from before COVID and one from a number of weeks ago, to show that while in COVID peacetime, so to speak, there was some wonderful creative storytelling, even amid the constraints of now, you're seeing some quite wonderful storytelling going on.
My name is Stephen. I've been working in Dublin Bus since 1982, and we are going to pick up people for the Pride Parade. And we're going to have the proud fathers on the bus.
How are you, Stephen?
Good to see you.
You would not in a million years get me to sit down with a shirt like this one time. Eyes for the braces, no chance.
It's probably a thing that I wouldn't go to, but I think we shouldn't be closed to ideas like that.
The initial reaction, I think, will be total and utter shock. He's not expecting this at all. Good morning, Liam. My reaction will probably be just a hug. Emotional now, even talking about it.
This is her first Pride Festival after telling everybody that she is gay.
I thought you were on holiday!
It's a very important step.
Anybody would be delighted to have one gay son, but to have two, I'd impress anybody with that story.
I hope to have a defibrillator in here because I tell them to need it. Good morning, my friend.
Oh my God.
They're incredible guys. Like, I just love the two of them to bits.
8 months ago, she told us she was going to be trans. And 2 months ago, she said she's changing her name to Michael. And from now on, she's going to be he.
Hey, Michael!
I always told you I was proud of you, and I always told you I'd support you. Let's go to Pride, son.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm actually going to enjoy it. And if I really enjoyed it, I might come back next year as well.
I have pride up over my head. Never in my life seen so many rainbows.
Hey, everyone! You're on Pride!
Driving on this morning and going into parade is fantastic. What more could you ask for?
Hello, me in 6 months' time. Firstly, sorry about all the weight gain, but in my defence, I was housebound and not wearing work trousers, so hope you're on top of that. How are you? I mean that because we actually mean it at the minute. When we're asking, I don't know if you remember, when we're checking in with each other, we really actually care about the answer. How are you? How's your health? How's your kids? How's your family? How's your head? Are you keeping it together? Keep looking out for each other, okay? Don't take each other for granted. How's Mum? Listen, we are really missing her. Don't take her for granted, okay? We are really missing her, and not just the childcare, okay?
So as you'll see there, two terrific examples of pre-COVID and mid-COVID storytelling, with so many of these examples of the storytelling model central to the effectiveness of both. Moving on, there's the question of leading with your fundamental values, your intent, and your habits. Now, I think it's terrific that in the last few years, we've seen the rise of the purpose revolution, that we're moving through, I'm sure you've seen this, the TED Talk, Simon Sinek's golden circle from the what to the how, but to the why. But I do sometimes wonder, and even before the current crisis wondered, whether the notion of purpose was too 30,000 feet, too generalized, and that actually what organizations needed to really be leading with was their intent, what it is that they want to bring about in the world. There's a great phrase from a sales trainer I once used, which was, it's not about what you communicate, it's what you cause. What is the end effect, the outcome? What is the after of what you create? And we see powerful examples. We saw this even before COVID. Greta Thunberg, her story was based on a single piece of intent. We need to save the planet. The adults are not acting. Therefore, I will and we will. One of the most remarkable pieces of intentional and intent-led storytelling we've seen in recent years. But equally, if people are hoping for the air to remain clean and the streams to run clean, then we don't have to start with a blank sheet of paper. Already the ESG revolution was starting. Already the TCFD guidance was there. Already the B Corp movement was starting to come into being. So as you look at meeting the expectations of true sustainability, again, you're not starting from scratch. You're starting by building on and potentially accelerating some of the tools and platforms already in place. And finally, in this section, I want to talk about habit. It's fantastic saying that you want to achieve something. It's another thing making it happen. We know that many of the things that the world has been bemoaning about the time before COVID were simply the result of global and corporate and individual habits. And we know that neural pathways are pretty hardwired, and the changing habit requires routine, it requires reminder, and it requires reward. It has to be smart, as we all know from our appraisals. That's the only way that change comes about. So if you're going to say we're going to be a more sustainable organization, if you're going to say we're going to treat our employees better and avoid the say-do gap between those claims and your delivery on them, then you will have to very, very consciously and in a highly structured way go about leading from the front when it comes to the changes in habit at a corporate, team, and individual level that will be required for the change to happen. Because otherwise, it might end up being warm words that could yet come back to haunt you. Two last points. One is what I called considering the shift from a service ethos to public service. One of the defining features of COVID-19 around the world has been the unbelievable love and respect that has rightly been shown, not only to those in public healthcare and private healthcare, but also to those in our public services writ large. Every Thursday, we in the UK at exactly 8 o'clock go onto the streets and clap for the NHS. But what I think this means is that people are now going to expect organisations to think about whether they're providing public service. A few examples. LVMH, back in March, first mover advantage of retooling their entire production line from perfumes to hand gel. Morrison's, the UK supermarket, radically changed their operations to feed the nation and send out food parcels. Premier Inn, a hotel chain, making their empty hotel rooms free to NHS staff. And Deliveroo, offering to use their delivery infrastructure to deliver free meals to exhausted and underfed NHS and public sector workers. So you might say, well, these were a feature of the COVID era, but the reality is the COVID era in some shape or form will be with us for a very long time to come. And therefore the question is whether you are going to have merely a customer service ethos or a public service ethos, because I believe the latter will be expected of you. We also have the championing of what I call true diversity and purposeful inclusion. This is a wonderful piece that was delivered by a terrific diversity and inclusion agency in the UK called the Unmistakable, where they essentially took the 26 letters of the alphabet to remind people that the A to Z of COVID-19 was actually as much about those not included, those from minority backgrounds and communities that were being hit particularly hard. And I've argued elsewhere that as well as race, gender, and belief, there has to be true psychological and cognitive diversity in the age of COVID. In other words, when people are remote working so much, are you thinking about them as individuals, as part of families with individual circumstances? Are you thinking about their individual mental health and well-being? Are you considering that for many, particularly the introverted, that the idea of sitting on a Zoom is not the best way to make their voice heard? And therefore, are you measuring them fairly or unfairly in terms of their productivity and their KPIs, when they may be every bit as efficient as the extroverts, if not more so, but because you're not in an office environment, you are missing that. So as I say, cognitive and psychological diversity and inclusion. And then finally, to come back to my old friend, the say-do gap, there is delivering what I call behavior-led communication. I'll allow you to read the rather good little Dilbert cartoon. Again, before COVID, we already saw organizations that claimed Volkswagen, to be the people's car. Terrific, unless and until you find out that they've been fixing emissions and ultimately testing emissions on monkeys. Not a good look. State Street Global Advisors, the fearless girl, cleaned up at Cannes. Only problem being that behaviourally they were an organisation who were treating their senior female staff and senior staff of colour in a completely discriminatory way, allegedly, in terms of pay and promotion. Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, everybody's friend, unless they're using your data to subvert the course of democracy. And Pepsi, thinking that a nice cold soda is going to solve race riots in the US, apologies. And one last example, again, from where I live in the UK, a hotel chain that early on informed staff at a 5-star Aviemore hotel they'd be out of a job by letter with legalese and the threat that if they'd taken extra holiday, it would be taken off their final paycheck. An already very poor brand, absolutely trashed, not just by their communication, but by the underlying corporate behavior behind it. So there we have it. And my challenge to you, to recap, is to start with the human imperative and think about the human experience, to be fearless in how you listen and respond, and to demonstrate radical transparency, to be purposeful and structured in your storytelling, to lead with your values and your intent, not just your purpose, and on the process of changing habits accordingly. Considering a shift not just from customer service, but to public service, championing true psychological and cognitive diversity and inclusion, and matching your words with your actions through behavior-led communication. I hope you found that useful. Do, of course, get in touch if you have any questions at all. You'll find a little reading pack of various pieces that I've written on facets of this and podcasts and webinars. And now I'm going to chat to Philippe about what I've covered. Stay safe, stay well, and I will see you on the other side.
Rod, thank you very much for your keynote and insights on this big topic, which of course is all about, how do we, well, first of all, we're already thinking on how will it be after this, but we're still in the middle of it. But still, we need to prepare for what is going to come. One thing that I wanted to focus on is the concept of transparency and radical transparency. Let's be honest, we're both public relations professionals with more than 20 years experience. It is not an easy topic, transparency, not always. And we also know that some organizations, simply because of the industry they're in, cannot be radically transparent. So how do you take that? How do you make that into a practice, into something practical that you can do as a communicator?
Well, I think partly, and I've written about this a couple of months ago for the IABC, I think there's a tendency in PR and comms that because we're trying to make people look as good or help people to be as good as they possibly can be, that therefore we fall into the trap of trying to make them look perfect. And I think because those we work with and advise are imperfect because they're human beings, that's always going to fail. We're always going to fall short. And therefore, if you look at some of the more powerful examples I gave of Arne Sorensen at Marriott, if you look at Airbnb, it's that human touch. It's that willingness to admit that you don't have all the answers, that you are doing everything within your power. You have a clear plan. You have a great team, but that not over-promising perfection. And I think it's that willingness to show vulnerability and imperfection that underlies some of the more powerful acts of communication, remembering, of course, that vulnerability and imperfection are not the same as weakness. In fact, very often that human touch can show imperfection, leading people to feel that you are in fact stronger, whereas apparent strength, and I won't point to any current world leaders, can be seen as flaws and weakness.
It does make me think in the context of something that we both pretty well specialized in crisis comms, where in crisis communications in the corporate world, at least me and I guess many of us have been trained and had this little voice of the lawyer next to us, like, if you're not certain, simply don't mention it. Where for the last couple of years I've been working in emergency risk comms, where it is very much okay, and you're trained in that way to say, I don't know. That's this kind of vulnerability. We're not perfect. We don't know how this virus will evolve and all these things. So it's probably that kind of balance that you have. Like, we're human. We don't know everything. We don't have the ultimate power of a visionary. And so that's what you mean with being human, being vulnerable, and by definition then being able to be transparent as well and saying, I don't really know.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that certainly in the UK, and I've seen it with some of the other scientists around the world, where the scientific and medical advisors will not be drawn into speculation, not because they've been media trained and they've been told we don't want hostages to fortune, but actually because they don't know. They're not going to give an answer that is false or misleading or partial. And I have to say, some of the most expert communicators in all of this have not been the communicators, it's been the scientists. And of course, I find it very amusing that in an era where experts had fallen out of favor, all of a sudden everybody loves an expert. And I think on the S word in crisis, I always say and always practice in advising clients in a crisis situation, there is a huge difference between saying sorry for having caused something and showing sorrow that something has happened. And I say that slowly and deliberately because it is a gulf of a difference. Yeah. And showing sorrow is not the same as saying sorry. And showing sorrow is not an admission of liability. It's a demonstration of humanity.
Completely agree with that. Yeah, definitely. I was very happy that you also touched on inclusion. That is one of the things where within my work I'm really attentive to, because when we communicate, and in the context of the current crisis, for instance, we do tend to forget about people who, for instance, do not have the means to protect themselves, who live outside of the official network, who I'm working on a project for a couple of countries in West Africa. In the visual communications around COVID, you do not show the sanitizer bottle because people don't have that. They don't have access to those bottles. It doesn't mean anything. It's a concept that. So can you go a bit deeper on that? Because it's really a topic I think as communicators is very important, and definitely in what's coming in the next couple of months.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll expand firstly on what I said during the presentation about this idea that in a world of Zoom and Skype, not everyone is created equal. That if there was already the risk that the extrovert was going to win out, and you've seen the TED Talks on the power of the introvert. I know as an extreme extrovert the many benefits that brings and the many problems and pitfalls. Yeah. The reality is that in a Zoom world, those who feel comfortable freewheeling and expressing themselves will automatically look, and I stress look, as if they are the ones with the greater contribution to make. And I think we have to be incredibly careful. And that's not the only axis, introvert versus extrovert. There are many other psychological axes that we need to look at. The point I'm making is that we cannot allow those who are born for this medium to look like they are the people making the greatest contribution. And therefore, how we assess and measure productivity, the KPIs, will probably have to change on a day-to-day level. So I think that's a micro example. I also think this idea of COVID as the great leveler, and the idea that in some way we're all going to move to sitting in our boxer shorts, drinking nice coffee and running our lives that way, that kind of works for the sort of intellectual salaried middle class. It ignores all the very people who have been keeping us safe and well and fed and watered with power, with heating. The list goes on. And I was chatting with a friend earlier on about, I coined a rather grand title, which is the new feudalism, which is in the olden days, the rich would sit behind their big gates and have the people downstairs literally bring them their food and look after their bedding. And then they'd have the people on the estate looking after them. We seriously risk creating a similar dynamic whereby those at home may enjoy their home ground Costa Rican coffee while doing Zoom with the office. But again, we're leaving people at the gates almost quite literally. So I think there is an inclusion and a diversity within the workplace, but I think there is also one beyond in society at large. And corporations and communicators absolutely have a role to play there, fundamentally.
Yeah. And then, the big thing, and I'm probably a pessimist in that area, but when we talk about change and the changes that need to happen, or that will have to happen, you speak about habit, reward, but it only just by looking at our industry, public relations professionals, we're not the biggest example of people who are flexible and change and adapt quickly and react. We are very conservative. Look at how long it took us to have the basic understanding of the web. And sometimes we still don't really get it. How are we going to cope with this? Because this is going to impact not only our profession, it will impact in-house communicators, agencies, our clients. We've spoken about mental health already. We were in very bad papers before COVID. This will be an enormous challenge.
Absolutely.
How do you see that happening for us? Because already, and I'm just talking about our profession, not even looking on a broader scope. Change is not something that we're very much used to, right?
No, and I think that there are a number of things here. The first is that with COVID itself, one of the areas I've seen rather lacking in many government responses, at least the UK's, is that behavioural science hasn't been front and centre. They claim it has, I haven't seen it. So I think, to your question, I think we will see psychology and behavioural psychology playing a greater role in two areas. One, I think, is in human resources, and I think that some of the best HR functions are already populated or at least drawing on really, really good psychological insights. The second, which obviously, if you're going to bet on anything in our industry, it is change and change comms, because already many of those are behavioral and organizational psychologists. And I think that those who already look at the change curve, who already look at change readiness, who look at the way in which you take people through the change cycle, that is going to be needed on steroids in a remote environment where you don't have the human interaction of a company meeting to read people's body languages, to spot the little glances between colleagues, to see those all important nodes playing out in real time. So I think psychology through change and HR is going to be absolutely fundamental. Like you, 50% of the time I'm optimistic. A lot of the time I'm slightly pessimistic, because I think that, they joke that PR agencies are terribly bad at their own comms. Give them change comms and it's an even different picture. So I hope that there is that acknowledgement. I think on your point about agility, and just to reassure your listeners, this wasn't a planted question. If I may talk briefly about the thing that a few of us launched last Thursday. So some of your listeners may have seen, some viewers, I suppose, may have seen a thing that I and 5 others launched last week called the Decision Circle. We're not an agency, we're a group of brand, corporate and marketing communicators, together with a psychologist, a business continuity expert, and an employment lawyer, who've set ourselves up to help small, mid-sized and small and mid-sized firms, charities and public bodies with the one thing that is really hard at the moment is high quality decision making at speed. Now that was born purely out of our observations of and conversations with smaller organizations and the need to do something. And we took that from a straw man idea I'd had to a complete launch in just under 4 weeks. So I'm not saying this entirely to blow our own trumpet, although we are quite proud. I'm saying it because agility is possible if you focus on listening to what the market needs and aligning your resources against it. So there's the public service broadcast over. I apologize for that.
No, but I completely agree, because I made the same decision 3 years ago, when it was, what am I going to do? Create an agency or create a network of independent senior consultants? Go for the network. Flexible. You don't need the whole overhead structure, what have you. Yep. You get all together if the client needs all of you, and you only get, what you need, and it's flexible. And I think that is something that many of us will have to learn. And there's the same model, I think, inside an organization, where it's not the department, it's bringing the right people at the right time together, working on something, and then in the agile way, change a thing on a continuous basis. So no, completely agree. And it's definitely something that, if more organizations and more professionals would work like that, I think it's also the best way to counter a possible next crisis. Yep. From an epidemic point of view, we know it will not be the last. So again, that is something that is definitely very worthwhile looking at and executing, like you've just done recently.
Yeah, and I do think, to your point about the next wave, this is not going to be an epidemic, a pandemic that starts in Asia, goes to Europe, goes to the US, and fizzles out. It will circle round the globe, and some of the more enlightened people are realizing that as a second or third wave, or as new clusters come up in Asia, that they in turn are learning from the lessons from Europe. So this is not a linear thing, and our learnings can't be linear either. And when you were talking, it does strike me this sort of cross-discipline working is perhaps a function of being a crisis person in some ways, because in a war room, you have no choice but to ensure that the different disciplines collaborate, because if they don't collaborate, bad things happen.
Yeah, and I mentioned that to another speaker when we were speaking about crisis comms as an example. When I'm sent out for WHO or the clients to, let's say, a West African country, there's one communicator, me. There is a sociologist, anthropologist, medical doctor, and someone who specialized in epidemics. And that's how you can understand the global thing and then work together on that. So is that diversity of different insights that does the job, definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Ron, thank you very much for taking the time to be on the summit. We could go on for hours again. I've had that with different speakers where we said, this is too short, let's do another one soon. So I hope we can do it again. But thanks for taking the time, and hope to talk soon.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Congratulations on the summit. It's a great idea.
Thank you.
Trot out the old joke, you know where I'm going to be, because I'm not going anywhere.
Okay, see you soon. Bye-bye.
Take care.